Conservative Party is urging the federal government to stand up to China, calling for specific words and actions.
Today, Canada's Conservatives are calling on the Parliament of Canada to recognize that genocide is currently being carried out by the People's Republic of China against Uighurs and other Turkic Muslims. I call on Prime Minister Trudeau to actively seek the relocation of the 2022 Olympic Games.
Calls echoed by the other opposition parties, but declarations the government is not yet ready to make.
We recognize that we have many partners who've already identified this as a genocide, and we will continue to work with them and others as we move forward in the right way for Canadians and indeed for people around the world.
So what is the opposition strategy here? How does freeing Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the two Canadians detained in China, play into how the government's own messaging is on this issue? It's Thursday. I'm here with At Issue, Chantal Hébert, Althea Raj, and Shachi Kurl joins us on this Thursday because Andrew is off. Good to see everybody. Let's start with you, Chantal, on the Conservative strategy. Why do you think they have chosen this issue at this moment? I mean, they've always been happy to talk about China and being tough on China, but why right now?
Because it's got legs in public opinion, because the Uighur reporting is quite damning on the human rights front, because most Canadians who are watching this from outside are thinking, how in the world are we going to be sending athletes to play in China, given everything that has happened and everything that is happening there?
And Althea, the fact that we have two Canadians being detained there, how much does that sort of prevent the government from being harder, from talking tougher?
Well, I suspect the way that you're asking the question, you know as well as we all do, that it is playing heavily in the government's approach to China. And frankly, that's one of the reasons why Justin Trudeau and the government has looked weak, has been vulnerable to Conservative attacks. Looks like they're indecisive. They're unsure what to do. The fact that we don't yet have an answer on whether Huawei is going to be allowed to be part of the 5G network in this country. everything is being seen, it seems, through the prism of the two Michaels. And that's why a lot of things on the China front are not going to get done. But I mean, to Chantal's point, the opposition motion is very smart on behalf of the Conservatives. Public opinion is squarely behind them. You don't even need to think just about COVID. Look at what has happened in Hong Kong. The trust factor that Canadians, China is the number one public enemy in public opinion polls when you look at where Canadians are. And it splits Liberals. I mean, Liberal MPs on the subcommittee voted to declare this a genocide. And so it's going to be very interesting to see which way the Liberal cabinet and some Liberal backbenchers vote on Monday.
Yeah, because the vote on the opposition day motion doesn't happen until Monday. It's interesting for all those reasons, Shachi, but it's also interesting that they want to talk about it now as opposed to COVID and other things. And you have to wonder if it's because, as Chantal suggests, it's getting more traction, this is as an issue.
Well, look, first of all, people are experiencing an incredible amount of pandemic fatigue. So how many weeks have panels like us and Canadians just completely maxed out on when is this going to end? When do we start to see vaccines coming online? But more than that, this is something that resonates with Canadians in a very visceral way. You know, Chantal and Althea talked about public opinion polling. Let me put some data behind that. 88% of Canadians saying that they don't trust Beijing on law and order or on human rights. 14%, 14% of Canadians say they have a favorable view of China. But what's the id on this? What's the big Benini on this in terms of Aaron O'Toole and his play? Mm-hmm. He's also doing this in part because it's an issue that allows him to grow his base and actually pick up some resonance with people who would not necessarily consider the Conservative Party on issues of the environment or on issues of social conscience or indeed on issues of vaccination. So here's a really clear policy issue that Canadians are aligned on, and he gets to come out and say, I'm being thoughtful about this, and I have an ability to actually reach across to people who maybe wouldn't consider the Conservatives for a lot of reasons, but might on China at a time when the Trudeau Liberals are fighting two things. They're fighting the fact that there's not a lot they can do on this file as long as the two Michaels are not home, and the fact that they now carry the stink of some 30 plus years of looking quite soft or warm or friendly with China, which will come back to haunt them long term.
Chantal, one more point on how the government's responded to this?
I'm guessing that the government's best plan would have been to wait to see if the Biden administration's arrival would have changed the paradigm on the two Michaels and given them a bit more room to maneuver. But it's becoming an issue of principle for many Canadians. And the Olympic Games, it's not some arcane public policy discussion here. People can do the math. 1 + 1 = what in the world are we doing? For Justin Trudeau, who found the word genocide not that loaded when it came to Indigenous Canadians, and perhaps he was right, but at this point, having seen what's happening in China, the question people are bound to ask is, if that's good enough for us, how can it not be what is happening there?
Okay, let's move on to the amended medical assistance in dying legislation passed in the Senate last night. It is now, there's another deadline now coming up next week for the government to respond. And the Senate moved to actually expand the criteria. And some of the criticism from that, Althea, inside the Senate was that the government was maybe too quick to respond to one lower court ruling instead of going to the Supreme Court or asking for another reference or some legal opinion around what was the best way to respond. What is this going to actually look like when it's done?
It's probably going to look like the bill that went to the Senate and not the bill that has come out of the Senate. The senators, and Don Plett, the leader of the Conservative Senate, had a good speech yesterday, I think, outlining a lot of the concerns that some who are not in the majority at all about this bill overwhelmingly passed the Senate with modified amendments that, as you say, enlarge the scope of the bill. But the Conservatives mostly, are concerned that, and I should say some Conservatives, are concerned that the bill does not give enough protection to people with disabilities who might feel pressured to have to take medically assisted dying. The Conservatives made the point that back in 2016, the government promised more investments in palliative care that would help solve some concerns on this front, and that really hasn't happened. But the overwhelming majority of senators really believe that the bill actually should be more expansive than even what the Quebec Superior Court said. I suspect that the Liberal government is not going to go there. Much like in 2016, we have obviously a very different justice minister, a minister that didn't even vote for the first version of medically assisted dying. But maybe the population isn't there. And this bill has to be reviewed anyways, not too far along in the future. So it's possible that they will take it under advisement. I mean, it is a minority government. The Conservative ranks themselves are split. The NDP and the Bloc seem to be more aligned with the senators' arguments, but they both believe that the upper house lacks legitimacy. So that's another interesting asterisk.
Twist, Shachi, it does seem as though, I mean, if you look at the amendments, it seems as though that maybe public opinion has moved very quickly around medically assisted dying, but maybe that's not what you've seen.
You know, the top line results around a lot of polls, the main takeaway is often that a majority of Canadians support this and they support opening it up even more. But within that, you know, there are pockets that are just not there yet. When we think about the divide between Quebec and the rest of Canada on this issue, Quebecers are consistently more likely to be supportive of opening it up, making it easier than people in other parts of the country. Within visible minority or immigrant communities, there's still a lot of pushback and a lot of concern. And not to say nothing of the concerns that exist within communities of people with disabilities. Althea touched on palliative care. There's also the long-term care issue. And so we're really also having a bit of a reckoning around how do we want to treat people at the end of their lives if they want to die at home and the investments aren't there, if they are disabled and there's a subtle pressure around, well, it's going to cost a lot of money to treat you, These are the things that I think people are not quite ready to go down that road around, and that's why you see that reticence from government.
And how much does politics fit into all of this, Chantal? That divide between Quebec and the rest of Canada, for instance?
It only fits in up to a point. To tell you the truth, if we'd waited for every pocket of resistance to abortion rights and same-sex marriage to disappear, it wouldn't have happened. I look at those votes in the House of Commons on the legislation to make it less restrictive and the vote in the Senate to make it even less restrictive than the House of Commons plan. 212 to 107, I would say, in the House of Commons, 4 parties versus 1. That's a pretty clear statement. Mm-hmm. In the Senate, 66 versus 19. So yes, there are objections and there are grounds for debate. But on one thing, the 2 houses have agreed, and it is that the current status quo should be made less restrictive.
And with this bill, we are keeping our promise to Canadians to reduce gun violence by strengthening our laws, prohibiting firearms which were designed only to kill, by placing significant and effective new restrictions on guns that are used by criminals, and by creating a regime to remove firearms from dangerous situations made deadly by the presence of a firearm.
That was the Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, announcing the government's new gun legislation introduced earlier this week. Chantal, Althea, and Shachi all back for an extended round of At Issue. Althea, I'm going to start with you. I mean, some of this was previously announced, but there has been criticism, I think, this week of whether it actually goes as far as the Liberals had suggested it would go, at least during the election campaign.
You think? It was vehemently opposed by so many people. Usually the Liberals are like Goldilocks with the 3 bears, like it's not too cold, it's not too hot, and they find a compromise in the middle, and that's where they like to be. In this case, they just managed to find a compromise that doesn't please anybody at all. They made things that are illegal more illegal. That's great. Then they suggested that, there's 2 parts to the law that they introduced, in fact, last year that they've reintroduced in an amended form. So the 2 parts that have basically annoyed a lot of Quebecers and even Canadians outside of Quebec is this idea of giving municipalities the right to ban handguns. This was criticized last time around for saying, this is kind of a stupid idea. You're just creating like a Swiss cheese approach. If you want to actually ban handguns, then use the federal government's power and ban handguns. And we had municipalities in Quebec and the mayor of Montreal come out and say, this doesn't make any sense. And Quebec, at the unanimity, the National Assembly said, well, if you don't want to do it, give us your powers, Ottawa, and we are going to ensure that there is a ban across the province so we don't have these gaping holes. At the same time, you have provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta who've actually prevented municipalities in their provinces from enacting handgun bans if that's what they want. So clearly, that part of the bill is not working the way the Liberals intended. The second part of the bill that is causing, people to scratch their head is the buyback program. If, as Bill Blair just said in that clip, those guns are only designed to kill, then why is this a voluntary buyback program? Either you want to get all these guns out of people's homes so that people do not die, or you trust people to keep their guns. And the Liberals have found a middle way of basically making that part of the bill practically useless. So in trying to please some people in the rural caucus and some police associations who fear the safety of police going into people's homes, you have annoyed everybody. And can I just add, and I'm talking a lot, that
we're almost out of time, but sure.
This is even more perplexing because this bill has to be amended. It is not going to be amended with the help of the Conservatives. So the NDP and the Bloc are going to amend this bill, and they are going to prevent the Liberals from having a win by basically amending the bill the way the Liberals promised that they were going to introduce it back in 2019. So on all these fronts, it's just like mind-boggling.
Okay, so what's going on here, Shachi? Like from the perspective of what Canadians want out of gun laws in this country and security and safety, does this reflect any of that?
well, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, they want to be driven crazy by this issue, right? This is the political equivalent of sticking your finger in a socket over and over again, because it is the ultimate wedge politics issue. It drives people nuts. If you're a gun owner in this country, every time there is discussion about gun control legislation, whether it is assault rifles or handguns, they will quote you, understandably, chapter and verse, everything they've had to do to obtain and legally possess a firearm. And this drives them crazy. On the other hand, if you are a suburban parent in Langley, BC, or in North York, where drive-by shootings and gang crime are invading your subdivision, you're worried about your kids being able to play outside. That is also something very real. So this is once again the Trudeau government, to an extent, communicating by symbol. Let's not worry about voluntary versus mandatory buyback. Let's not get into a fight over jurisdiction, because frankly, it's only the politicians that talk about that. Yeah. Let's give ourselves a talking point that enables us to go back into urban areas where we are weak, where we're potentially weak, where the opposition leader says, I'm coming for you and I'm coming for your voters, and gives them something to make them feel a little more safe at night. And you can't quantify that perception of safety. And so it is a very powerful message, even if it's flawed completely in practice.
Okay, Chantal, what's your take on what this is, and whether it's doing the kinds of things that Shachi suggests that they want it to do, I guess?
We are 3 weeks from a virtual Conservative convention. And the first political objective that the Liberals meet by doing this week is that it makes gun advocates come out of the woodwork, not always in a way that would suit a moderate message on the legislation. And it reminds voters, the suburban voters that Sachi talked about gun control, and the fact that the Conservatives are more associated with a pro-gun lobby than the other parties. So there is a political objective there. As for the practicality of it, I live in downtown Montreal. If I drive for 5 minutes, I'm going to be in Westmount, a different city. I'm not saying that Westmount wants to allow gun laws that are more liberal than the city of Montreal. I'm just saying I only need to drive 5 minutes to potentially be in an area where the rules are different. And that doesn't make sense.
Okay, that was a good conversation. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.